Have you ever felt invisible in a room where the light was measured in crowns and decrees? Have you wondered whether quiet obedience and small acts of faithfulness could ever change the course of a history written by kings? The story recorded in the book of Esther, chapter 2, answers that for us not with thunder, but with careful providence. God at work in the margins, favor arriving like a fragrance after a season of preparation. In the wide halls of Shushan, where banners gleamed and voices rose in command, a young woman named Hadassah, Esther, would learn the strange power of hidden grace, and a man named Mordecai would show how a single faithful choice at a palace gate could be a seed for a future deliverance. It began in a season of upheaval. King Ahasuerus sat on a throne adorned by the wealth of many provinces, his court full of satraps and officers who bent themselves to policy and display. The removal of Queen Vashti had left a vacancy beside the king, and the echo of that absence moved through the palace like a shadow. The king's counselors spoke swiftly. Decrees were considered. The rumor spread that from all the provinces the king would take maidens to the house of the women to be prepared for his pleasure and for a possible place at his side. In that summons, the machinery of empire showed itself. Messengers, eunuchs, lists of names, the slow sorting of peoples by their looks and manner. From the city of Shushan there came many, and among them, brought from the custody of Mordecai the Jew, was a young woman called Hadassah. She was an orphan. Her father and mother had died, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter. Her Hebrew name, Hadassah, a myrtle, spoke of quietness and fragrant steadfastness. The name later given to her by the court, Esther, carried the mystery of concealment. The two names together would hold the paradox of her life, a visible brightness that kept its private root. Mordecai's presence at the gate of the king's palace was habitual. He sat in the porch not as a man seeking honor, but as a sentinel of faithfulness. The gate was a place of news, of petitions, of listening. He belonged to a people who had been scattered, and who carried within them stories of exile and survival. His lineage, of the tribe of Benjamin, mattered in the quiet ways it informed his conduct. A man formed by memory, by law, by the posture of a people who had learned to watch and wait. From the gate he saw comings and goings. From the gate he could act. Esther's removal to the house of the women was not an occasion of pomp, but of patient preparation. The chief custodian of the women, Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the king's daughters, took charge of those who were brought there. He was a careful man of the court, familiar with the patterns of favor and the torrents of palace life.
When Esther won favor in his eyes, he gave her special beauty treatments, myrrh and aromatic oils, dresses, and whatever she needed for the long months of preparation. In a culture that spoke of scent and sight as the language of welcome, myrrh was not merely cosmetic. It was a sign that one was being readied, shaped, and set apart. The preparations were long. For each young woman there were 12 months allotted, 6 months of oil of myrrh for purification, and 6 months of perfumes and preparations for the women. Imagine the slow succession of seasons in the house of the women. Jars of aromatic ointments being opened and set aside, the hush of attendants trimming hair and easing anxiety, the steady hand of a custodian who understood that one season of patient attention could determine a future moment on the throne. In those months, Esther learned restraint and dignity. She answered not with haste, but with humility. She did not flaunt her origins. And when Mordecai instructed her to keep her people and her lineage secret, she did so. That silence was not merely concealment, but obedience, an offering of trust to a man who loved her and to a future unknown. There is a kind of power in silence when it is chosen. Esther's secrecy was not deception, but wise prudence, in a time when identity could be weaponized. She carried within her the memory of her people, and yet she wore the garb of a palace, a stranger who would become beloved. Haggai's favor was practical and visible. The king's notice was slower, but it came. When it was Esther's turn to appear before King Ahasuerus, she found grace in the sight of all who saw her. The king loved her more than all the other women. He set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. The narrative does not pretend to explain why favor rests on some and not others, but it records the fact. Favor came, and with it the astonishment of a young woman, but newly raised from namelessness to prominence. Yet the story is careful to show the seams. Esther did not come to the throne by her will alone. The hand of another was at work. Mordecai, who had sat at the gate and kept watch, did something that belonged more to quiet courage than to public acclaim. He discovered a plot, 2 of the king's officers conspiring to assassinate the king. The intrigue was hidden among the clatter of the court, but Mordecai saw it. He reported it, and the matter was laid before the king. The conspirators were executed, their names were recorded, and the event was written in the chronicles of the king. That recording, so prosaic a detail, would later appear as a decisive thread in the tapestry of providence. What Mordecai did was simple and right. He exposed wickedness when he found it, and he trusted the authority of words being set down. There is holiness in such small reckonings, a guard at the gate who refuses to look away.
As these events unfolded, Esther's ascent, Mordecai's report, the palace moved on with its banquets and ceremonial observances. But beneath the public life, the quiet workings of favor and record-keeping continued like a subterranean stream. Haggai continued to provide for Esther. Servants tended to her. The king hosted a feast for the people and the provinces. It is in the ordinary motions of a court that providence often hides itself, not always with a thunderbolt, but by a string of practical acts and remembered words. Pause here for a moment and consider the themes that rise like aromatics from this chapter. First, providence often works through small, faithful choices. Mordecai's presence at the gate, his willingness to sit, to listen, to bear witness, was not glamorous, but it allowed him to do the right thing when the moment came. Second, favor can be a gift that arrives in the months of preparation. Esther's beauty, her composure, the favor she found with Haggai and then the king, were connected to the long season of being made ready. Third, secrecy and obedience are not always signs of fear, but of wisdom. Esther's keeping of her lineage at Mordecai's council preserved her for a greater purpose. These are not abstract lessons. They are practical truths for anyone who has felt sidelined or overlooked. The smell of myrrh lingers as an emblem. Think of it as a sacrament of preparation. Its bitter-sweet scent a reminder that beauty in service is not cheap or instantaneous. It takes time to be seasoned rightly. The crown of gold that later rested upon Esther's head was not simply the reward of aesthetics. It was the visible sign of a longer process that included restraint, instruction, and a guardian's faithful care. If you have ever wondered whether the quiet seasons of your life are wasted, remember that in the palace of Shushan, the months of aromatic oils preceded the public display. God often honors what has been faithfully tended in private. The narrative also places a high value on the recording of truth. When Mordecai reported the plot, the chroniclers did more than record names. They preserved a record that could not easily be erased. The Chronicle of the King, those dry official pages, became a kind of ark for truth. There is a spiritual lesson here. The faithful account of what is right and just matters. Not every good deed is seen, but the witness of faithful testimony, the refusing to be silent before wickedness, establishes a record that eternity may keep. Your small acts of courage, your refusal to conceal an injustice, may be the very things that God preserves for a later season of vindication. There is another pattern in this chapter, the reversal of worldly measures. A foreign orphan becomes queen. A gate-sitter's report becomes part of the royal chronicle. The world measures by proximity to power, by lineage, by display. God's economy measures by faithfulness, by the readiness of the heart, by the willingness to obey, even when the cost is invisibility. Esther's power was unseen at first. It was a power that won favor quietly and then radiated outward. We might call it the power of grace, the capacity to draw others not by force, but by an inner dignity that commands respect. Do not misunderstand. The narrative does not present Esther as a passive object of providence. She chooses to obey Mordecai. She speaks and acts with the manner of one who understands the stakes of appearance and discretion. When she enters the king's presence, it is not with raw bravado, but with a composed beauty that suggests inner formation. Haggai's kindness is an instrument in her favor, but Esther herself perseveres in ways visible to those who can read character. She refrains from revealing what might have been told for private advantage. She holds back, perhaps trusting that God, who watches the lowly, will not be absent. Picture the house of the women, its quiet chambers, the low murmur of attendants, the jars of fragrant ointments on low tables. Women converse in hushed tones about costumes, about the next appointment, about the anxiety of women who do not know whether favor will come. In such rooms, the most consequential choices may yet be made. The choice to obey a guardian, the choice to submit to a regiment for the sake of preparation, the choice to carry a secret rather than use it for personal advantage. That is the stage of Esther's becoming. And what of Mordecai? There is a humility in his character that invites imitation. He does not thrust himself into the center. He sits at the gate. He listens. He reads the news. He refuses to honor schemes that endanger the king. He is content to be the man who knows when to speak and when to silence. His report of the plot is not a daring public spectacle. It is a steady act of duty. Yet the record of that duty will later surface as a providential sign. Consider the implications. Your quiet acts of faithfulness, secret prayers, small sacrifices, the defense of truth in a conversation, may be the very ingredients that God will later use to orchestrate deliverance. The narrative also allows us to feel the tension between human power and divine hand. King Ahasuerus is grand and capricious. He makes decrees. He hosts banquets. He selects a queen from among many. He does not know the invisible network of loyalty and courage that will one day challenge schemes against a people in peril. But the chapter is not about the king's righteousness. It is about the way the sovereign God uses earthly instruments. This is a pastoral comfort. God's governance is not thwarted by royal whim. The highest courts of human rule are, in the end, part of a larger tapestry. When the moment of coronation arrives, it is both climactic and quiet. Esther is raised to honor. The crowd sees a young woman transformed into queen, and the sound of praise likely follows.
Yet the inner story continues. She remains a steward of a secret, a child of the diaspora abiding in a palace. She does not explode into triumph. She accepts the honor with restraint. In that restraint is strength. Her power, unseen at first, becomes seen, and it will be counted among the instruments of salvation in days to come. There is one final detail in this chapter that deserves our close attention: the chronicling. The scribes of the king write things down. At first glance, it seems a bureaucratic footnote, but the text gives space to the notion that records endure. The chroniclers are caretakers of memory. Their ink carries forward what might otherwise fade. The spiritual application is plain. Preserve what is right. Do not despise small works of integrity because they are not immediately rewarded. God's providence often works through the memory of faithful acts. Now, as I draw these reflections together, consider three pastoral points that emerge with clarity from Esther chapter 2. 1. Providence is patient and often hidden. The making of a queen begins in the work of a custodian and in months of aromatic preparation. The movement of God in your life may be slow, shaped by seasons that feel ordinary. 2. Faithfulness in small things matters. Mordecai at the gate could have been indifferent. He was not. Your small acts, telling the truth, refusing to join a plot, showing kindness, are the threads God weaves into a greater deliverance. 3. Humility and discretion can be a form of power. Esther's silence about her lineage was strategic obedience. Power in God's kingdom does not always roar. It often arrives through those who are humble and faithful. If you are listening as someone who feels overlooked, remember Esther in the house of the women. The months of myrrh, the slow favor, the unseen eyes that watched, and were being watched by one who orders history. If you are someone tempted to think that your small acts are inconsequential, remember Mordecai and the gate, a witness preserved in ink, a fidelity that would one day be used in the service of a people. The palace continued to bustle, banquets were given, and the record of deeds was kept. The threads set earlier in this chapter were now woven into place. Yet this setting prepares what will come next, a test of courage and a need to reveal identity at the right moment, when silence must turn into a word for life and death. For now, the aroma of myrrh still clings to the clothing. The gate remains a place of vigil, and the crown hangs ready to be worn, not as the end of the story, but as the sign that preparation and providence often precede public purpose. And it came to pass after these things that a man of stature and favor rose to a place of power in the king's court. His name was Haman the Agagite. The king promoted him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him.
The princes and servants bowed and paid him honor. Among them stood Mordecai, who walked at the king's gate, and he did not bow nor pay him honor. The story that follows is simple in its sequence and terrible in its consequence. Haman, enraged at one man's refusal, made the refusal into a wound upon his pride. Men exalted him. One man refused to abase himself, and pride became malice. Haman's anger burned, and when he learned that Mordecai was of the nation of the Jews, his wrath found a wider aim. He spoke with himself. He sought counsel of his friends and his wife Zeresh, and they fed the fire of his design. There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the nations, he argued. Their laws are different. They do not obey the king's decrees. Let us destroy them and make a sure proclamation that they be destroyed. He cast his plot upon the king's table as if it were a matter of state, and the king, who delighted in Haman's company, gave him his ring and his signet, granting him authority to put his counsel into a written decree. Haman took counsel with himself about the time. He cast the pur, the lot, to choose the day. The lot fell, and he fixed a date. He wrote letters in the king's name and sealed them with the king's ring to all the provinces from India and to Ethiopia, to every people under the whole heaven. In each language and with every seal he summoned the governors. A decree was sent that in one day, set by lot, all the Jews in the king's provinces should be destroyed, slain, and their goods plundered. The message rode on swift messengers across the empire. The ink of the king's seal turned private vengeance into public law. When the letters came and the people read them, there was terror and astonishment among the Jews. Young men and old, merchants and mothers, listened and trembled. In every province and at every gate where the Jews met, there were sighs of despair. Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. He went through the city, crying aloud with a great and bitter cry. Women wailing, families stunned. The whole household of Mordecai was plunged into mourning. The life of a people was threatened by the whim of a man, elevated by the favor of a king. Word of this came unto the palace. Esther heard, and consternation girded her. She had been clothed in the garments of the queen. She sat at the gate of the palace no more as a private woman, yet her people now lay under sentence of death. Mordecai sent to her a copy of the writing, and gave her the command, "Show thyself unto the king, and make intercession for thy people." His heart sent the message, and his hands prepared the tokens. Esther's soul was moved. As a daughter of the house of Abihail, she had learned restraint, yet now the silence that had once served her became a prison. Here is the turning where the quiet life meets crisis.
Esther answered not at once. She sent back to Mordecai, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that every man and woman which shall come into the inner court unto the king, who is not called, hath but one law, to be put to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I will go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." She called not only upon courage, but upon faith. Mordecai sent back this reply, "Do not think to escape in the king's house any more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther's reply to Mordecai is a hinge. She did not rush to the court as one who trusted in her own wit alone. She chose instead a path of prayer and fasting. She bade Mordecai to gather the Jews that were in Shushan, and to fast for her, neither to eat nor to drink for 3 days, night and day. "My maids and I will fast likewise," she said, "and then I will go in unto the king, though it be against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went his way, and did as Esther had commanded him. There is much that deserves our careful thought in this movement of the story. Notice 3 things that this crisis makes plain. 1. Providence does not always act apart from risk. Esther's accession to the throne and Mordecai's place at the gate were parts of a design that God can use. Yet deliverance required a deliberate exposure to danger. Faith often calls those whom God has favor upon to enter peril on behalf of others. The instruments of deliverance are not safe by virtue of their position. They are tested by it. 2. Public authority can be used for private vengeance. Haman turned royal favor into a mechanism for personal spite. The tale is a stern warning. Institutions may be instruments of justice or instruments of wrath, depending on the hearts that wield them. When a people's protection is placed into fallible hands, mercy is made dependent upon the moral temper of rulers and counselors. The servant of God must therefore both pray and act, preserving conscience amid systems that can be corrupted by pride. 3. Identity disclosed in crisis reveals vocation. Esther can no longer live as one whose Jewishness is a private matter. The crisis obliges her to take up the mantle of representative. Her silence had been strategic obedience. Now silence must become testimony. So it is often with those whom providence raises. Secrets hold weight only so long as a peril does not require their removal. The revealing of identity may cost everything, but it may also be the necessary passage through which a people are saved. As the fast began in Shushan, the city itself took on the dimness of lament.
The royal palace, with its perfumes and banquets, was shadowed by sorrow. Esther's attendants, trained in the ways of court, knelt and supplicated. The women of the community spread sackcloth upon their bodies. The house of Mordecai was a house of tears. The contrast between the courtly world and the household of the exile sharpened the stakes. Splendor cannot protect when law is turned against human life. During those days of fasting and petition, Esther prepared not only outward apparel, but inward purpose. She arrayed herself as one who would stand in the breach between a king's favor and a people's doom. There was neither flattery nor manipulation in her resolve. There was a measured courage that acknowledged the penalty for unbidden approach and accepted it if it must come. In that acceptance lay freedom. To stand willing to die for others is to transcend the fetters of fear. Yet before the door of the king there is always mystery. Will the king stretch out his golden scepter? Will the sovereign, moved by sight or counsel, alter the course of decree? The narrative preserves both suspense and assurance. It gives us neither an easy triumph nor a blank hopelessness. The instruments, fasting, petition, royal protocol, are present together. The people do what they can, and providence awaits to work by means. These are the lessons pressed upon the heart now, that faith is active in the face of law, that influence is accountable to righteousness, and that identity true in secret will find its voice in crisis. The stage is set for Esther's bold approach, an approach that will demand prudence as much as daring, and patience as much as petition. For the moment, the city holds its breath, and the palace, perfumed and ornate, bears in its center a woman who carries a people within her silence. The coming scenes will show how favor and fear, counsel and courage, ink and edict will be instruments in a struggle whose outcome will be counted among the ways God orders history. So the slow clock of providence turns. The edict stands written, the fast is proclaimed. Mordecai waits at the gate, and Esther girds her spirit to enter where the law forbade. In the hush of Shushan, beneath the shadow of banners and pillars, prayer is made as a weapon and as a shield. The next step will ask the question every servant faces. Will faith risk everything when the alternative is to preserve self at the cost of others? The answer lies in the heart of one who has been prepared by seasons of obscurity to meet a moment of peril. So Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house. The king sat upon his royal throne in the hall, and his sight fell upon Esther, and she found favor in his eyes. And he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther drew near, and touched the top of the scepter. The king said unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be given thee to the half of the kingdom.
Esther answered, If it please the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto a banquet that I have prepared. And the king said, Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther hath spoken. Haman went forth that day joyfully, and with a glad heart. And when Haman saw Mordecai in the gate, who sat and did not bow nor tremble before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Yet he restrained himself because of the king. In his house he made merry that day with wine, and his heart conceived devices of pride. He commanded that a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and he told his wife Zeresh and all his friends, saying, There is a people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of the king, and their laws are diverse from those of every people. Therefore it profiteth me to set a stake and to destroy them. And they advised him and encouraged him in his counsel. On the morrow the king remembered Esther and what she had said, and he sent unto her a second time by Haman the man for the banquet that she had prepared. Haman rejoiced in his heart at the invitation, and he thought in his heart, Who is there that would desire to see the queen of her banquet but myself? I shall be exalted above all. So he returned to his house, and prepared the gallows, and sat down in the gate, and waited for that day. But the king could not sleep the same night, and he commanded that the book of the Chronicles, the records of the reign, should be read before him. It was found written how Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 chamberlains, who sought to lay hands on the king. The king said, What honor and dignity have been done to Mordecai for this? Then Haman came into the king's house to speak with the king about the hanging of Mordecai. And the king asked him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Haman thought within himself, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And Haman answered the king, Let the royal apparel be brought, which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let the apparel and the horse be delivered to one of the king's most noble princes. And let him array the man withal, and bear the crown upon him, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Then the king said to Haman, Make haste, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that thou hast spoken. So Haman took the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman went home mourning and with his head covered.
When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends how that Mordecai, whom he hated, was honored of the king, they said unto him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, thou canst not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. Then was Haman full of rage, and his countenance was changed, and he told them of the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. His counsel remained, and he went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet the king again said unto Esther, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then Esther, with a voice that was steady, though her heart beat sore, said, If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition, and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and on the morrow I will declare my petition. Haman went out that night with joy, but with a heavy foreboding upon him. On the morrow, as the king and Haman came to the banquet of Esther, Esther said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Then the king, being moved with anger and with a fierce displeasure, asked of the queen, Who is he, and where is he, that durst so do? Esther answered, A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. They that stood by told the king of the gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king. And the king said, Haman shall be hanged thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. The king's wrath abated, and Esther's pleading prevailed. The king gave Haman's house unto Esther, and the king set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Yet the pen of the king and the stamp of the signet could not be recalled, for the adversaries of the Jews had been authoritatively commissioned by the earlier writing. And so the king granted to Esther and to Mordecai that there might be written unto the Jews that which would defend them, and that the king's forces might be at their aid. Letters were sent in every province, granting the Jews liberty to assemble and to stand for their lives against those that would destroy them. In Shushan the Jews slew their enemies, and in the provinces the Lord brought deliverance unto them, and their fear fell upon those that sought their hurt. After these things the Jews rested and made a season of remembrance and of joy. They ordained and confirmed among themselves, and among their seed, and among all those that were joined unto them, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every family and in every province, that it should be a feast of feasting, and a season of gladness, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. Thus was Purim established, and the name of Mordecai was written in the chronicles before the king. And he continued to be great in the house of the king. So ended the peril that had hung over a people, and the instruments of power that had been bent to wrath were turned to shame. Mercy had found its hour in the courage of one who would not hide in the season of trial, and Providence had ordered that a throne that might have been instrument of ruin should be turned to deliverance. The tale was told in the gates and in the courts, and the memory of that deliverance endured among the sons of those whom God had preserved.